Driving in racing games is really fun, but just driving laps in circles on your own with no objective tends to get boring fast. This is why racing games need some sort of meta game, something that gives your driving a greater purpose. That is what we typically refer to as a career mode. You start with a slow car, do races, get prize money, upgrade your car, unlock new races, and so on. The kind of content that is notably even still lacking from basically all modern sim racing titles to this day. Although the adoption of online multiplayer modes with active driver skill and safety ratings that iRacing pioneered in the late 2000s is finally finding its way into more and more sims and gradually replacing the traditional community-organized leagues. But another, much simpler way to implement a racing metagame could be to add a time trial leaderboard. You simply let players compare the lap times against each other. Although this is typically not super motivating on its own, because the only goal or motivation a playing leaderboard presents you with is reaching the top, which the vast majority of players will quickly give up on because it doesn't actually feel achievable. You could also create intermediate goals, like reaching the top 1000 or reaching the top 10%, but I have not seen many games do this. Probably because the required times for that would be constantly changing, and many racing game leaderboards are also plagued by cheaters, which distorts the overall picture. By the way, quick editor's note, the video that's been running in the background from Hokiyoshi is highly relevant to the subject and you should definitely check it out. Link in the description. Okay, thanks, bye. What I think you should do instead is let the developers determine one or more target lap times for every track and create time trial challenges that way. That is computationally much simpler to implement than a full-on career mode, but it can absolutely be equally engaging. I recently noticed this myself again in the licenses for the newly released Assetto Corsa Evo and the campaign for the classic Trackmania Nations Forever. I thought about just how little it actually takes in terms of game design to create an experience that seriously hooks you, just with driving mechanics, track design and target times. It is so simple in fact that it technically doesn't even have to be integrated into the game itself. Although coming up with appropriate target lap times is a challenge by itself. I myself could just start driving every track in every game, but that would take way too much time, although it would no doubt be very fun. So what we need is essentially a repository or a dataset of racing game lap times. And let me know if you know of any other ones, but my first instinct was to check speedrun.com. Of course, speedruns are usually about completing entire games in one go, but I was curious if they were also tracking times for individual tracks, and sure enough, they did. So that gives us world record lap times for different tracks in a lot of racing games that have been verified for legitimacy and that have replays available which players can study to improve. But as we discussed earlier, a world record alone isn't enough, so we somehow have to automatically derive achievable lap times, similar to how Trackmania does it. Although not exactly how Trackmania does it, because those tracks tend to have much crazier shortcuts and techniques to save huge amounts of time, compared to most of the more down-to-earth arcade racers. But to effectively quantify difficulty in racing games, I do still think that the top X% approach I discussed earlier is still promising to ensure that we end up with times that are achievable for average players, but still challenging even for advanced players. So that's when I asked myself, if we assume something like top 10 corresponds to a gold medal, top 25 corresponds to silver, and top 50% corresponds to bronze, what percentage gaps in lap time would that correspond to? To figure this out, we need another dataset. But this time one that includes a large enough sample of lap times from different players to actually be representative. So I searched around the internet for a bit and eventually discovered that Gran Turismo Sport used to have an API that would let you access the entire qualifying leaderboard for a big chunk of the daily races in GT Sport's lifespan. And the reason I'm speaking in past tense is that it has unfortunately been shut down in January of 2024. And I was also unable to find any sort of freely accessible archive of the data. Now luckily, the data we need can still be viewed on a website called kudosprime.com, but without the full dataset, I can really only manually grab a limited number of samples and run my analysis on that. It also does make me a little bit nervous that this incredibly valuable data is only accessible from a single website with rate limiting, so if it ever goes offline for whatever reason, the data is completely lost forever. There was a contact email on the website, so I did try to inquire about this with the admin of the site, but it's been over a month now and so far there has been no response. Looks like the games themselves are not the only thing that need regulation for an end-of-life plan at this point. But anyway, from the handful of samples I've collected, I got the distribution you can see here, and that answers my original question. Top 10% corresponds to 104%, top 25% corresponds to 105%, and top 50% corresponds to 107%, which is coincidentally also the slowest permitted qualifying lap time in Formula 1. Although I rounded the first value down to 103 for aesthetics. And so, by using these values to extrapolate the world records from speedrun.com, we can effectively create gold, silver and bronze medal time trials for every racing game in existence. Although the validity of this approach remains somewhat dubious, since speedruns typically rely on various degrees of exploits for the fastest times, and we're making the assumption that Gran Turismo is representative for the entire racing game genre in this regard. This might result in even bronze times being disproportionately difficult to achieve under normal circumstances on some games. Do let me know if you find any challenges where this is the case. Although I did make sure to only include categories from the glitchless or equivalent categories whenever possible. And another problem for Black Box era Need for Speed games is that the timer does not seem to provide consistent results, which unfortunately also introduces some RNG into the laps. But with those caveats out of the way, I decided to put together a website called racingtrials.net that automatically calculates and organizes these new challenges. Ideally, I wanted the website to have as much soul and personality as the classic racing games featured on it. Which turned out to be quite challenging, but I tried to go as far as my creativity and web development skills would take me. And this is what I ended up with. The landing page is like a canvas with logos from 30 different classic racing games, and you also get this wallpaper background if you hover over one, which I think looks quite nice. On the game pages themselves, you can see I went for this sort of handwritten table look, where you can check off the challenges you completed, and where you also get this nice little medal animation before they get added to your total in the top left corner. In case the speedrun.com API had extra metadata about subcategories and player choices, I included it as well. Like for Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 for example, we have the direction and the car choice, but unfortunately not all games have much useful data. Regardless, together with the category and replays, it should hopefully give you enough context to start making progress. So if this sounds interesting, I encourage you to go to racingtrials.net at the link in the description, try it out for yourself and tell me what you think. Also, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to keep following my journey to bring back awesome racing games. Hold on, since it's 20 seconds to 8 minutes and I'm unreasonably optimistic, let me just keep yapping for a bit. I can say that I had a lot of fun working on the website, and maybe the video even more so to be honest, but my god did it take longer than I expected. This was supposed to be like a weekend project, but together with this video it took almost 2 months. Working with the speedrun.com API was a lot more complicated than I expected, and I also tried to find some way to like URL encode player progress so that you could register medals from your phone, for instance, but I just couldn't get it working. Likewise, I also wanted to go a lot further with the design and turn it into complete racing nostalgia heaven, but I was like, okay, I should probably pace myself here and wait to see if there's actual demand for a project like this. And if there is, we can still develop it further and maybe add a few more games, because not a lot of thought went into the current list, to be honest. In that case, I would probably also clean up the code a bit and make it open source, so other people can contribute to it. The ultimate dream would of course be to somehow integrate it into the games directly. Like I know Retro Achievements obviously manages to somehow hook into and emulate its memory, but I've not yet looked into how it works. Hell, honestly, I've barely even done any difficulty testing on the time trials themselves. Maybe that's also worth making videos about. But I do have a few other ideas as well, in this weird racing game design niche I'm trying to carve out here. Okay, that should be enough. As I said, if you have any feedback, questions or suggestions around the website or this video, it is my first video essay after all, make sure to leave a comment. It would mean a lot. Alright, see ya!